Top 10 Deadly Pandemics of the Past. A pandemic happens when an infection transforms into a worldwide episode. The ongoing coronavirus, COVID-19, is presently viewed as a pandemic. The dangerous infection is influencing individuals everywhere throughout the world. It is making nations close their fringes, encourage individuals to remain inside, and request organizations to stop activities. Be that as it may, this isn't the first occasion when that a pandemic has influenced such a significant number of lives without a moment's delay. Right now, look at probably the deadliest pandemics of the past. 10. Leprosy. Uncleanliness, otherwise known as Hansen's illness, is a moderate creating bacterial sickness that can prompt harm of the nerves, skin, eyes, and respiratory tract. Those tainted by the ailment may encounter poor visual perception and muscle shortcoming. A few patients can no longer feel torment, which may bring about the fractional loss of furthest points. The illness has influenced people for a large number of years, however it turned into a pandemic in Europe during the Middle Ages, as they were considered to be unclean. Contaminated people needed to wear certain attire or a ringer to flag their appearance. Be that as it may, they were prohibited to go to numerous areas. It is accepted that around 19,000 outcast houses existed in Europe during this time, called the Living Dead. Outsiders were connected to sin and pronounced lawfully dead by municipal pioneers who appropriated the assets of the wiped out. There are still around 200,000 instances of disease a year, however it would now be able to be restored with medicine. Be that as it may, a few patients need continuous treatment for difficulties like visual impairment and loss of motion. 9. Russian flu. 1889–1890. The Russian influenza, otherwise known as Asiatic influenza, was a dangerous flu pandemic that executed roughly 1 million individuals around the world. The flare-up began spreading in 1889 and was the biggest 19th-century plague of flu. It was additionally the primary genuine scourge that occurred in the period of bacteriology. The starting cases were accounted for in Bukhara in Central Asia, Turkestan, Athabasca in northwestern Canada, and Greenland. Inside a half year, the sickness had contaminated St. Petersburg, Russia. Just 4 months after the fact, the flu had spread all through the northern half of the globe. Quick populous development in urban zones over the globe assisted with making a pandemic. 8. The Third Cholera Pandemic. 1852–1860. The deadliest of the 7 cholera flare-ups was the third significant flare-up that kept going from 1852 to 1860. Much the same as the initial 2 pandemics, the third began in India and spread all through Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. In 1854, the most exceedingly awful year, cholera slaughtered 23,000 individuals in Great Britain. Around 10,000 of those casualties were from London. During the third cholera pandemic, around 1 million individuals lost their lives. Numerous passings originated from Russia, Chicago, Tokyo, Spain, Venezuela, and Brazil. Sullied water was believed to be the reason for cholera. British Dr. John Snow followed cases in London and distinguished polluted water as the reason for the transmission of the illness. He followed the water to the Broad Street siphon and persuaded neighborhood authorities to evacuate the siphon handle. In spite of the fact that the amount of nearby cases drastically diminished after his discoveries, the numbers kept on ascending in different zones of the world for a couple of more years. 7. Smallpox. 1520. For quite a long time, smallpox was a threat in Europe, Asia, and Arabia. 3 of each 10 tainted individuals kicked the bucket. The principal European voyagers carried the infection to the New World, where individuals were not safe to the malady. The individuals of cutting-edge Mexico and the United States saw demise rates a lot higher than those of the Old World. Some flare-ups of smallpox were viewed as pestilences. Here, we'll talk about the one of every 1,520 that crushed the Aztec Empire. However, by and large, the spread of the malady over the globe made it a pandemic. In North and South America, smallpox took around 100 years to decimate around 90% of the indigenous individuals. In Mexico, the populace dropped to 1 million individuals from around 11 million preceding the European victory. Eventually, the savage infection helped the Spanish to overcome the Aztecs and Incas in light of the fact that their populaces scarcely existed gratitude to the disease. Centuries later, smallpox was the primary infection pandemic halted by an antibody. In 1980, the World Health Organization pronounced that smallpox had been destroyed over the globe. 6. Antonine Plague. 165 to 180. Perhaps the deadliest pandemic in history is likewise one of the most established. The Antonine Plague happened in 165 to 180 and at last ended the lives of around 5 million individuals. The Romans carried the sickness back home with them after a war with the Parthians. The infection began in Asia Minor and afterwards spread to Greece and Italy. For the following 2 decades, the Roman Empire saw an episode dissimilar to anything they had ever experienced. At the pinnacle of the spread, they were seeing around 2,000 fatalities for each day. It was evaluated that 7 to 10% of the whole Roman Empire was killed, with higher rates in denser areas. The realms Carulus Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus both kicked the bucket during this time span. Many have hypothesized that they were murdered by this malady. In spite of the fact that the disease that assaulted these individuals is obscure, numerous researchers trust it was a flare-up of smallpox. 5. Asian flu. 1957–58. In the 20th century, the second significant flu pandemic was the Asian influenza of 1957, otherwise known as the Asian influenza pandemic. The flare-up was liable for more than 1 million deaths. At the start of the Asian influenza pandemic, the infection spread all through China and the encompassing areas. Months after the fact, this season's cold virus had arrived at the United States and was across the board in the United Kingdom. Just 3 months into 1958, the United States had assessed that about 70,000 passings were connected to the Asian influenza. An immunization was in the end built up that contained the pandemic. For the Great Plague. 1665–66. As a major aspect of the Second Plague pandemic, the Great Plague of 1665 made pioneers close all open amusement and seal the wiped out in their homes to help forestall the spread of the infection. Taking all things together, London lost around 15% of its populace. Despite the fact that the city recorded around 69,000 passings, the genuine number is accepted to be over 100,000. When the plague showed up in a family unit, a red cross was painted on the entryway with the words, "Ruler, show leniency toward us." Later, the inert bodies were expelled and taken in a truck to a plague pit. 3. Black Death. 1347–1351. One of the most wrecking pandemics in history was the Great Bubonic Plague, otherwise known as the Dark Death, in the mid-1300s. A fatal episode of the bubonic plague began in China during the 1330s. As the nation was one of the busiest exchanging countries, the sickness immediately spread elsewhere. By 1347, the Black Death had shown up in Europe after a few tainted boats docked at Messina, a Sicilian port. Only 5 years after the fact, the plague had murdered more than 20 million individuals in Europe. The Black Death is broadly accepted to have been brought about by Yersinia pestis microscopic organisms. The illness for the most part spread to individuals from the chomps of tainted rodents and bugs. From that point, it was exceptionally irresistible among humans. The plague caused a fever alongside buboes growing of the lymph organs. The malady likewise delivered ruddy spots on the skin that turned dark, which is the reason individuals considered it the Black Death. To the Third Plague Pandemic. 1855–1960. In 1855, during the Xianfeng Emperor's rule of the Qing administration, the Third Plague Pandemic started in China. This fatal bubonic plague in the long run went through India and Hong Kong, slaughtering in any event 12 to 15 million individuals. India endured the most setbacks with in excess of 10 million deaths. This was the third major bubonic plague flare-up to hit European culture. The sickness was at first spread by bugs during a mining blast in Yunnan, China. Setbacks from the Third Plague Pandemic dropped to less than 200 every year in 1960. Around then, the World Health Organization confirmed that the plague was not, at this point, dynamic. 1 Spanish flu. 1918–1920. The deadliest influenza pandemic in history began in 1918 and tainted around 33% of the total populace, or roughly 500 million individuals. In spite of the fact that evaluations fluctuate, it is accepted that the Spanish influenza executed around 50 million individuals, including very nearly 700,000 Americans. The first rush of the flu happened in spring 1918, and it was commonly gentle. The subsequent wave was exceptionally infectious and hit the world with a vengeance. The Spanish influenza was at first found in Europe, the United States, and Asia before spreading over the globe. Survivors of the flu were biting the dust inside hours and long periods of creating manifestations. The normal life expectancy in the U.S. had diminished by 12 years after the Spanish influenza had been around for only 1 year. Schools, private homes, and different structures became temporary clinics due to congestion in clinical offices. Isolates were forced, individuals were requested to wear covers, and organizations were closed down until the infection finished its destructive run.